The first thing I saw when I opened my curtains that morning was a pair of inflatable flamingos dancing in my hayfield, and the second was Karen in a silk robe waving at me from the roof of her RV like she owned the place. For a split second, I thought I'd sleepwalked into a reality show. Then the smell of burnt diesel and hairspray hit me, and I knew this was real. Karen had parked a full-size camper right in the middle of my cattle pasture. I didn't bother changing out of my flannel pajamas. I stormed out the front door, past my confused cows lingering near the fence line, and right up to the glaring chrome beast that now sat like a sunbathing walrus in my field. There were lawn chairs, there were coolers, there were Bluetooth speakers blasting early 2000s pop songs like it was spring break in Nebraska, and there was Karen sipping some kind of neon cocktail from a pineapple-shaped cup. She looked at me over her sunglasses and said, "Oh, don't worry, we'll only be here for a few days. It's just a little girl's getaway." I didn't say anything for a solid 5 seconds because I was trying to make sure my jaw didn't hit the ground. This wasn't some back corner of shared land. This was my privately owned, deed-registered, fenced-off grazing field, and Karen had just driven her monstrosity of a camper right through my eastern gate, snapping off part of my fence post in the process, and settled in like she was at a state park. "You drove through my fence," I finally said, pointing at the splintered wood. Karen glanced over her shoulder and waved dismissively. "It looked old anyway, and besides, it's just grass." I thought this whole area was community space. You don't mind sharing, do you? My cows, bless them, were gathered on the other side of the field, uncertain about approaching the giant metallic beast and the loud women lounging on lawn chairs with tanning oil and open containers. My prize heifer Maple looked particularly disturbed. I wasn't just mad. I was boiling. But I had learned, painfully, that confronting Karen without backup was like punching water. She'd slither through every logical hole and wrap it back around me. So I called the sheriff. While I waited, I paced the edge of the field like a furious mall cop, watching as Karen's guests grilled burgers on a portable flame near my dry grass, which, by the way, was a clear fire hazard. One of her friends was even stringing fairy lights between two old fence posts like it was prom night on my ranch. I heard the familiar crunch of gravel as Sheriff Doug's cruiser pulled up. He got out, took one look at the scene, and sighed like a man who knew his Saturday had been ruined before it started. "Let me guess," he said. "Karen?" I nodded. Doug walked over and asked her the obvious. "Ma'am, did you get permission to be here?" Karen didn't miss a beat. I talked to the HOA's temporary recreation chairperson. He said the board had informally approved temporary camping use during weekends if the space was not actively being used. Doug blinked. "This is private ranch land, not HOA common space." Karen gave a sugary smile. "That's not what the online map says. There's a dotted line around this field on the app." "Which app?" "Some hiking thing. I think it's called Trail Snap." Doug turned to me, lips pressed together like he was physically holding in a scream. "She's citing a fitness app as a legal property map?" "Yep," I said deadpan. Doug tried, he really did, but since Karen hadn't technically been trespassed yet, and there was no posted signage on that side of the field, he gave me the usual. "Document everything. I'll file a report, but until you post official notices or file civilly, we're limited here." Karen waved again. "Thanks, officer. Want a burger?" He didn't answer. I went back to the house, steam practically coming out of my ears. By dusk, her guests were dancing to a portable speaker, and someone was doing karaoke to Britney Spears right where I usually stacked hay. The cows had retreated to the furthest edge of the field, agitated and lowing in confusion. I called my vet just to be safe, and she told me cattle are sensitive to sudden changes in noise, especially with machinery around. "Keep them away from that area," she warned. "Stress can trigger all kinds of issues." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while the muffled bass of Karen's party pulsed through the stillness of the countryside. I thought about the fine she'd issued me last year for improper shrub grooming and offensive signage, a homemade No Karen Zone poster my nephew made me for Christmas. I thought about the time she tried to get my livestock declared a neighborhood disturbance after my rooster crowed at 5:30 a.m. and now here she was, tanning on my pasture like she'd booked a spa weekend. I was raised not to start fights, but I was also raised to protect what's mine. Karen thought she could park her camper on my land and walk away scot-free, but if she wanted a taste of ranch life, then she was about to get the full meal, horns, hooves, and all. And I knew just how to serve it. By the time morning rolled around, I wasn't just ready. I was locked, loaded, and staring out the kitchen window like a general surveying the battlefield. Karen's RV still squatted in the center of my field like a stubborn boil. The flamingos were still dancing in the breeze, and her guests had started making breakfast on a portable griddle. The smell of sausage wafted across the field, and my cows, confused and curious, inched closer in a tight, hesitant line. That's when the idea struck me, simple, natural, and poetic. I was going to use the most peaceful army I had, my cattle. I poured out a full bucket of grain, the good kind with molasses that made the cows go wild, and walked to the edge of the field near the RV. I didn't say a word. I didn't yell or wave my arms. I just dumped the grain in a slow spiraling circle around the camper, making sure to drop an extra scoop near the water hookup and the fold-out stairs. Then I opened the gate. At first, the cows were cautious. They looked at me, then at the RV, then back at me. But Maple, my brave old girl, took the first step. Her hooves crunched softly on the morning grass as she made her way toward the scent of molasses. One by one, the others followed. Within minutes, the herd was moving like a slow, determined tide toward the camper. Karen's friend spotted them first. She screamed like she'd seen a ghost, clutching a mug of coffee and scrambling to climb on top of the picnic table. Another woman tripped over a cooler trying to reach the RV door. Karen herself emerged a moment later, her hair wrapped in a towel, holding a Bluetooth speaker in one hand and a curling iron in the other. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, a full ring of cows silently surrounding her camper like some kind of bovine ritual. "What the hell is this?" she shouted, her voice high and panicked. I leaned on the fence, sipping my coffee. "They're grazing." "This is harassment," she snapped. "You can't weaponize livestock." I raised my eyebrows. "Karen, it's a cow pasture. You parked in it." Maple, bless her heart, moseyed over to the camper's side mirror and licked it thoroughly. Another cow sniffed at the steps and sneezed, launching a chunk of grain onto the mat inside. Something rattled. Karen shrieked again and slammed the RV door shut, only to open it seconds later and toss out her pineapple-shaped cup, which hit the grass and rolled to a stop next to a cow's hoof. The cow sniffed it, decided it wasn't grain, and moved on. I watched with satisfaction as the cows milled around her camper, jostling slightly, rubbing their sides against the metal, and occasionally lowing with the deep, mournful sound of confused but content animals. Karen's RV began to rock slightly from the movement. Her solar panel creaked as one cow scratched its head on the mounting bracket. The Bluetooth speaker, which had been playing acoustic pop, went silent with a sharp pop of disconnection. That's when Karen made her move. She opened the window and stuck out a selfie stick, recording a video while shouting into her phone. "This is targeted aggression. I am being trapped by cows in a hate crime orchestrated by a backwards rancher." I nearly dropped my mug. Meanwhile, the cows were perfectly content. They were doing what cows do, eating, shifting, nudging each other, and relieving themselves wherever they felt like. One particularly large steer plopped down for a nap in front of Karen's generator, effectively blocking her only power source. The others began chewing cud in lazy unison, surrounding the camper like they were guarding a sacred object. By noon, Karen's guests had fully retreated inside the RV, their laughter replaced with muffled complaints. I saw a woman slap the window and yell something about the smell. Another peeked out and gagged before slamming the blinds shut. Then the final touch. Karen called animal control. I saw the county truck pull up just after 1. A young officer climbed out, clipboard in hand, sunglasses reflecting the herd like a nature documentary. He approached slowly, stepping around a cow pie and squinting toward me. "Got a call about aggressive livestock," he said, trying not to smile. I gestured toward the scene. "They're just grazing. On my land." He nodded, clearly trying to suppress a chuckle. That one's licking the hubcap. Good zinc in there, I replied. He walked through the field with the calm of someone used to country chaos. The cows barely looked up. When he reached the RV, Karen flung the door open and launched into a tirade. They boxed us in. They surrounded the camper, and now they're rubbing against it like it's a scratching post. This is harassment. I demand they be removed. The officer scribbled a note. They're not threatening you. They're looking at me, she screeched. He glanced at Maple, who yawned and blinked slowly in the sun. Ma'am, cows are not capable of criminal intent. Karen slammed the door again. The officer turned back toward me and shrugged. Honestly, he said, I've seen people try to use drones, dogs, even blaring music in HOA wars. Cows? This is new. They're just livestock doing their job, I said. He left without issuing any citation. In fact, he waved to Maple on the way out and called her ma'am. I stood at the fence, arms crossed, watching the herd peacefully graze and chew and lounge like nature intended. By sunset, Karen's once luxurious weekend getaway had become a petting zoo panic room. The cows hadn't moved. They'd formed a protective ring of ruminating justice, and the best part, I didn't lift a finger. I hadn't yelled. I hadn't threatened. I hadn't even touched her camper. I'd simply opened a gate, and now Karen was learning, in the most country way possible, that nature doesn't care about HOA bylaws. That night, the stars came out, and the field glowed under moonlight. I could hear muffled arguing inside the RV, interrupted occasionally by a loud moo or the thump of a cow leaning too hard against the siding. I slept like a rock, and I knew this was just the beginning. The next morning brought with it the unmistakable sound of chaos disguised as order. Karen was on a mission. From the kitchen window, I watched her in a neon pink tracksuit, pacing in front of her camper while barking into a phone headset and pointing dramatically at cows that barely acknowledged her existence. Her entire RV now had duct tape signs plastered on the windows, handwritten in red marker with words like unlawful cattle blockade and hostile agricultural surrounding. It looked less like a weekend retreat and more like a doomsday bunker being held hostage by a ruminant militia. My herd was still camped out peacefully, lying in the morning sun or chewing cud with a level of serenity that only cows could maintain in the middle of someone else's tantrum. She wasn't just shouting into the phone anymore. She was live streaming. I could hear her voice even from the porch. Friends, this is a developing situation. We are being unlawfully detained by an aggressive rancher using cows as biological barriers. I need the HOA, my legal team, and honestly, someone from CNN. This cannot stand. Every time she panned the camera to a cow, the poor animal would look up, blink once, and go right back to doing absolutely nothing threatening. About an hour later, a line of compact cars and golf carts started pulling into the gravel shoulder by the field. I'd seen this crew before, Karen's loyal HOA buddies, the kind who showed up to monthly meetings in matching polo shirts and spent more time talking about community optics than actual neighborhood problems. They formed a makeshift circle near the camper and began unloading folding chairs, clipboards, and what appeared to be a mobile presentation stand. That's when I realized what was happening. Karen was hosting a full-blown emergency HOA meeting in my field without asking. I walked to the fence line, coffee in hand, and watched in disbelief. Karen's voice rang out over a battery-powered speaker. As acting vice president of community engagement, I am invoking emergency protocol 4.2 bits, allowing for mobile quorum gatherings in times of recreational conflict. A man in a wide-brimmed hat nodded solemnly and began taking attendance. They had a banner, a literal banner that read, "Reclaim the recreation space," in glittery letters, tied between two tomato cages. Karen launched into a slideshow with laminated pages that flapped in the wind, featuring bullet points like pasture potential, yoga, picnics, and goat therapy, and barriers to beautification, livestock, fencing, and attitude. I nearly choked on my coffee. Then she dropped the bombshell. With support from the board, she announced, I propose we formally submit a motion to reclassify this field as shared recreational land. The HOA would take over maintenance, implement zoning for community use, and prevent future obstruction by large animals or uncooperative landowners. The crowd clapped. Someone even whistled. I walked down the path, climbed over the stile fence, and approached the gathering just as one of my cows let out a long, echoing moo that seemed to punctuate the absurdity of the moment. Karen turned to me with a smirk, clearly expecting me to explode or make a scene, but I didn't. Instead, I pulled a folder from under my arm and handed it to the nearest clipboard-carrying member. "This," I said, "is the deed to my property. You'll find that it includes grazing rights, full agricultural zoning, and legal access protections dating back to my grandfather. You'll also find a clause specifically prohibiting repurposing of the land for non-agricultural use without my express written permission." Karen blinked. Someone near her muttered, "Oh." I continued, voice calm. "Furthermore, I've filed a civil complaint for trespassing, vandalism, your fence stunt, and environmental damage from your leaking generator. And just to top it off, I've contacted the zoning board. They'll be here by end of day." The silence was beautiful. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. One of the HOA members coughed awkwardly and started packing up the folding chairs. The woman with the attendance sheet slid it quietly back into her tote bag. Karen tried to regain control. "That land is being underutilized. Your cows can graze anywhere. This is about the good of the community." "You want the cows to graze on the tennis court instead?" I asked. She sputtered. "That's not the point." I leaned in slightly, my voice low enough for her ears only. "You could have asked. You could have called. But instead, you broke onto my land, hosted a rave in the pasture, and now you're holding HOA meetings next to cow pies." Before she could respond, a shout rang out. One of Karen's guests, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in days, was flailing his arms and pointing at the camper. "We're sinking," he yelled. "The RV is sinking." I turned around. Sure enough, the camper was listing to one side, the rear tires halfway submerged in the soft, waterlogged soil that had been trampled by dozens of hooves and saturated by last week's irrigation cycle. The makeshift patio setup had tipped, sending a cooler rolling into the drainage ditch and splashing mud across one of the remaining flamingos. The cows, meanwhile, hadn't moved. They watched it all unfold like stoic spectators at a slow-motion train wreck. Karen screamed. She rushed over, stepping in a puddle and nearly twisting her ankle. Her glitter banner snapped in the wind and fluttered to the ground as her voice hit a pitch so high I'm surprised glass didn't shatter. Her guests rushed to pack, tossing lawn chairs and food containers into car trunks and fleeing like survivors from a failed expedition. Within 20 minutes, the HOA meeting had collapsed. The banner was gone. The tomato cages were bent. Karen stood ankle-deep in mud, her RV groaning ominously behind her as one of the cows decided to take a long, slow leap directly onto her portable speaker. She turned toward me, face red with fury. "This isn't over." I gave a small shrug. "You're right. You still have to deal with the zoning board and the sheriff and probably a tow truck." She stomped back to her camper, slipping slightly and catching herself on the railing, now bent from one of my steer's earlier scratches. I walked back up to my porch and took a seat in my rocking chair, just in time to hear another great moo rise from the pasture, this one long and low, like a farewell song to an empire crumbling in real time. Karen had tried to play queen of the pasture, but on my land, the crown belongs to the herd. By the next morning, the sun rose over a battlefield of deflated pride and cow pies. Karen's camper sat crooked in the muddy depression left by its tires, tilted just enough to give it the sad aura of a shipwrecked yacht. Her guests had all but disappeared during the night, save for one older couple who left quietly in the early hours, dragging a suitcase and muttering something about never camping again. The glitter sign was gone. The tomato cages had been trampled flat. The only things left standing were Karen and her limitless entitlement. I was back at the kitchen table with my coffee when the sheriff's cruiser rolled in again, this time slower, like it already expected another chapter in the ongoing saga. Sheriff Doug stepped out, hands on his belt, giving a long, slow look across the scene. A cow ambled past him, tail swishing. He didn't flinch. He walked straight up to the RV and knocked. Karen opened the door with a look that oscillated wildly between righteous indignation and desperate self-pity. Her voice cracked immediately into a high-pitched whine. "She's weaponizing her cows against me. I'm being biologically harassed. My camper is damaged, my guests are traumatized, and I have been stranded on an unstable piece of land like some kind of hostage." Doug tilted his head like he was listening to a toddler tell a story about dragons and invisible friends. He nodded slowly, then looked over his shoulder at me standing at the fence with my mug. "Ma'am," he said, turning back to her, "you do realize you're on private property. That fence you drove through had a no trespassing sign on the other side." Karen's voice snapped. "That sign was faded, and I had verbal permission." "From who?" "From the HOA interim recreation coordinator." "That's not a real thing, Karen," Doug said, exhaling. "You made it up. You can't create positions and policies because you like camping somewhere you don't own. This isn't HOA land. It's a cattle pasture." She folded her arms. "Then I want her charged with intentional livestock aggression. She let cows graze." He replied, "On a pasture that she owns," Karen stammered, blinking like she'd been slapped by logic. But Doug wasn't there to argue. He had paperwork, official papers. He handed her a folded envelope sealed with a bright blue stamp. "That's a formal trespass warning. You've been notified. From this moment forward, if you stay here or return without permission, it becomes criminal trespass. Also, the zoning board will be here within the hour. They want to look at the environmental damage from your generator and all that trampled soil around the irrigation line." Karen's eyes widened. "She set this up. She's trying to ruin me." I gave a soft wave. "You did that just fine on your own." She slammed the door so hard the entire camper shuddered. A few moments later, the back panel creaked open, and I heard the rumble of something being dragged out. Her generator, now covered in what looked like cow saliva and duct tape. It thudded to the ground like a dead weight. About 45 minutes later, the zoning inspector arrived. A man named Ben with a clipboard, a soil probe, and absolutely no patience for HOA nonsense. He took one look at the crater where the camper had sunk, squinted at the blackened patch where the generator had leaked, and started muttering in shorthand. Karen tried to intercept him, babbling about how she had beautification rights, how this land was underutilized, and her actions were part of a community enrichment program. Ben didn't even pause. "This here's zoned for livestock," he said flatly. "Not tailgate brunches, not motor homes, not backyard concerts. And that fuel leak's going to be flagged." "I didn't know the land was wet," she shrieked. "It's a pasture, man," he said. "It's supposed to be wet sometimes." Karen followed him like a ghost, her hair askew, her voice rising and falling like a siren that no longer had any effect. He ignored her completely, took photos, poked the soil a few times, and walked off the field without even saying goodbye. 2 hours later, a certified tow truck arrived to extract her RV. It was a massive rig with dual winches and a set of industrial mats that looked like they were meant for military recovery operations. The driver took one look at the situation, spat his gum into a napkin, and said, "Going to be a long afternoon." Karen stood with her arms crossed, watching her kingdom of cows be dismantled piece by piece. The cows didn't even react. They simply shifted slightly, still chewing and blinking like sages. A few had wandered closer to the mess out of sheer curiosity. One even leaned its chin on the hitch of the tow truck, watching the operation like a foreman. When the RV finally creaked out of the mud and onto stable gravel, it looked like it had aged 10 years. The siding was scratched, the steps were dented, and the undercarriage was streaked with mud, hay, and some very questionable brown spots. Karen stared at it with a mix of heartbreak and humiliation. The driver asked where she wanted it moved. She didn't answer. I stepped forward. "Sheriff says the nearest legal place to park is the community center lot," I offered helpfully. "You'll be visible to your neighbors and close to town. Plenty of fresh air." Karen turned slowly, rage bubbling under her skin. "You think you've won." "I didn't have to win anything," I replied. "I just waited. The land took care of it." She climbed into the cab of the RV like a defeated monarch boarding her last carriage. The tow truck led her out with the slow, inevitable grace of a funeral procession. The cows parted gently, watching her go, tails flicking lazily behind them. As the last of the glitter and tire ruts faded behind her, I finally walked back to the middle of the field. The soil was torn up, sure, but it would heal. Grass always did. I knelt down and scattered a little clover seed across the scared ground. The cows gathered around me as if they knew the fight was over. The field was quiet again. No speakers, no neon, no lawn ornaments or folding chairs. Just me, the herd, and the kind of peace you only get after surviving a storm of someone else's making. The war was nearly over, but I knew one thing. Karen had pushed every limit, and now she was the one being fenced out. The days that followed felt like an exhale that had been held far too long. The field began to dry out under the steady sun, the indentations from Karen's RV slowly flattening with each gentle pass of hooves. My cows returned to their usual grazing patterns, no longer clustered in defense formation but spread out across the pasture like they were reclaiming their home. The fence post she broke was fixed, the signs were cleaned and reposted, and I planted a wildflower mix around the patch where the generator had scorched the grass just to ensure it grew back brighter than before. There was no more shouting, no more karaoke at dawn, and no more HOA banners fluttering in the wind pretending this was anything but a working ranch. Karen, for a while, disappeared entirely. Her RV sat silently in the far lot behind the HOA Community Center, a place I only passed when I had to pick up feed or mail. The windows were covered, the flamingos were gone, and every time I saw it, a smile tugged at the corner of my mouth, not from cruelty, but from the satisfying taste of a lesson taught by nature itself. Her grand takeover had collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance, and no cow had needed to say a word. Word about what happened traveled faster than I expected. It started with the TikTok video. Someone from the emergency HOA meeting had filmed the cows slowly surrounding the camper like it was a ritual. Another clip surfaced of Karen yelling about hostile hooved harassment, and the internet did what it does best. It laughed. Within 2 days, I got a message request from a reporter out of Austin. By day 4, someone mailed me a hoodie with a cartoon cow and sunglasses that said Moo Enforcement Unit across the front. I didn't ask for it, but I wore it anyway. Even Sheriff Doug stopped by for a chuckle. He pulled into my drive with a 6-pack of root beer and leaned against the hood of his cruiser, nodding toward the field. "You know," he said, "I've been in law enforcement 22 years, and I've seen a lot of folks do dumb things, but I've never once seen someone try to seize pasture land with a glitter banner and a camping stove." "She was determined," I said, sipping from the bottle. "She was nuts," he replied, "but at least she won't be back any time soon." "Do you think she'll try something else?" "Not unless she wants to explain herself to the zoning board, the sheriff's office, and half the county. From what I hear, her standing with the HOA's been, let's just say, revised. And he wasn't wrong. About a week after the showdown, a letter showed up in my mailbox, tucked inside a pink envelope with daisies printed along the edge. It was from Wendy, the newly appointed acting president of the HOA. She was known for her practical sense and had apparently been done with Karen long before the field fiasco. Inside the card was a short note, handwritten in blue ink. "Please accept my apologies on behalf of the HOA. I baked you something to say thank you for your patience. And also, wow." Attached to the note was a Tupperware of peach pie and a short typed statement revoking any further HOA attempts to reclassify or repropose surrounding land. It was official, sealed, and satisfying. Wendy came by a few days later herself, looking sheepish but friendly. She stood on my porch with a second pie and a peace-offering expression. We sat for a few minutes and talked about the incident, mostly laughing, occasionally shaking our heads like survivors of a strange dream. She promised no more antics, no more unauthorized meetings, and definitely no more rogue campers. "You know," she said, taking a sip of iced tea, "Karen told everyone she was building bridges. She forgot you need permission to cross one first. When she left, I stood on the porch a while, watching the cows shuffle slowly along the back fence, swatting flies with their tails and stopping now and then to graze in the cool of the evening. Peace had returned. not just to the field but to the whole rhythm of my days. There was something steadying in knowing that the land was mine, the rules were clear, and nature had a way of defending itself without me having to shout. That weekend, a car drove slowly past my property and stopped near the gate. It was a small silver SUV with tinted windows. The driver sat there for a minute, engine running, window slightly cracked. I watched from the porch, mug in hand. Then the window rolled down just enough for me to see Karen's unmistakable profile. Sunglasses perched atop her head, arms folded tight across her chest. She looked at the field, then at the cows, then at the new wooden sign I'd installed near the entrance. It read simply, "Private property, grazing area, enter at your own risk." One of the cows happened to be standing right next to it, chewing slowly, staring straight at her like a sentry. Karen didn't get out. She didn't even wave. After a few seconds, the window went back up, and the SUV pulled away. I didn't follow it. I didn't need to. Some battles don't end in shouting. Some end in silence, in distance, and in the knowledge that a line had been drawn and held. That evening, I walked the edge of the pasture, checking the fence, fixing a loose wire, and spreading a little more clover seed. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden shadows over the field. The cows followed me as they always did, curious and calm. When I reached the far gate, I turned around to see them all lined up behind me, a quiet herd of protectors, guardians, and unexpected heroes. I gave Maple a gentle pat on the nose. She blinked at me, slow and peaceful, then nudged her head against my shoulder like a punctuation mark on the end of a long story. No one ever expected a herd of cattle to defend a ranch, but sometimes the best defense isn't loud or legal. It's slow, steady, patient. Sometimes justice rumbles in the belly of the land itself, and in this little patch of earth, surrounded by fences, silence, and strong-willed cows, I had found a kind of peace no HOA could ever take away.